Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, The Francophile Reader. So I thought I would start a new series on my channel. This of course isn't changing any of the other kinds of videos that I do here, but since the video that actually brings most people to my channel is Plato's Symposium, I feel like it doesn't really matter, what kind of videos I make. I'm free to kind of make the videos I want to make. I'm not really tied to any particular brand, although I do predominantly make videos about Francophone literature and history. I do want to talk about other kinds of nonfiction. In particular, I want to talk about National Geographic magazines because about 5 or 6 years ago, I got a subscription to National Geographic. And my parents have since renewed the subscription because they read the magazines. But unfortunately, I have piles of magazines I have never gotten to. And so I thought that I could use my channel as an opportunity to talk about the National Geographic magazines that I have in my family's house. And hopefully, I could read them and maybe we can donate them, do something with them. And also, having just read the June 2020 issue, I was reminded of how much I love National Geographic. I mean, I am reminded of it on the daily because I watch the National Geographic channel religiously. And I also read articles online, both on the English language and the French language National Geographic websites. But I feel like this is great because it covers a whole wide range of topics, not just history, but also science. I was a biology major as well as a French major when I was an undergrad, and I did a year of a PhD in entomology, which is the study of insects, so I was in agricultural science. And I feel like science isn't talked about very much on BookTube, so I feel like National Geographic magazine is a great opportunity for me to review the things that I have learned and to learn new things on a wide range of topics. So I thought today I would start with, like I said, the June 2020 issue, and on the spines, I don't know if you could tell, on the spines you have all of the major articles in the magazine. So the cover article is World War II Voices, but there's also Hiroshima Memories, Emperor Penguins, Women in Politics, and Skateboarding. So my favorite article was definitely the cover article, The Last Voices of World War II, where a series of World War II survivors talk about their experience fighting in the war or, growing up during the war. Those who are still living are in their 90s. So people who actually experienced World War II are dying. It's really important that we capture their stories, the ones who are willing to share their experiences. There were a few that really stopped me in my tracks. The one was about a British soldier who was captured, and when he was released, he realized how many women and children had been, German women and children, I think, had been killed by the British, and just how horrific it was that there were so many civilians who died. There were over 66 million people, both fighters and civilians, who died during World War II. There were articles from various countries, different backgrounds. Of course, there were articles about Holocaust survivors. There was an article about an African-American man who fought. He was a fighter pilot for the Tuskegee Airmen, and what it meant for him to be an African-American fighting for the United States at a time when African-Americans didn't have rights. Women who were code breakers during the war, and how that was a way for them to be involved on the national front, but not just in baking, but also in, using their intellect in different ways. There were stories of war crimes committed. And just, you get the sense of the tragedy of war, but also some of the opportunities that people had because of the war. And it makes me uncomfortable to say that because 66 million people, I think over 66 million people died during World War II, making it the war with the greatest death rate. And then there was an entire article about the Hiroshima Nagasaki bombings and about the Japanese who survived the atomic bombs and how they were stigmatized because people didn't really understand radiation and whether it would affect children. And so one of the people interviewed was not allowed to ever get married because there was fear that their children would have some kind of mutations because of the bombings. There's also this museum that has been built since, talking about, what actually happened with, something almost similar to the Holocaust Museum, showing you footage of what the bombings actually did. And I thought it was a really fantastic article. I think even for that reason, this magazine is definitely worth picking up. If you don't have the money to subscribe to this magazine, although it's not tremendously expensive, if you're in the United States, your public libraries will probably have a subscription to National Geographic, and you can check out the magazines. That's how I used to read the articles for years in high school. So I know around Christmas time, they usually have various sales, and if you're a first-time subscriber, there's different deals. But anyway, I am not sponsored. I mean, can you imagine if I were sponsored by National Geographic? That would be really interesting. Then there was the article in Emperor Penguins. That was probably the most disappointing article, but only really for me, who watches nature shows all day long and reads books by biologists about different organisms. So I have seen nearly every show on emperor penguins that has ever been made. So I already know everything about the emperor penguins. I mean, that's not true, but this article wasn't telling me anything new. I think if you've never seen any of these documentaries and you really don't know that the male emperor penguin is the one that cares for the egg, then you should read this article. But for me, it wasn't anything unique. The one on women in politics was great because it talked about, the great question is which women are being raised up in the different countries that this article looks at. So there are women in politics that are interviewed in Bolivia, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in New Zealand. And while in all of these countries there are women in politics, in some of the countries it's controversial for women to have any kind of voice, period. Women's education is controversial. In some of these countries, there are quotas where, there have to be so many female parliament members. But that doesn't mean that their voices are heard. Just because there are these quotas doesn't mean that the women are really affecting policy in any real way. There's this woman in Bolivia who was physically attacked by her opponents. And, how she felt like the male candidates, the male politicians don't face this kind of violence. And then, women in New Zealand and Maori women who, they do occupy some seats in the parliament, but they're not the voice that is heard, even though New Zealand has had 3 female prime ministers. So the question is really which women are being heard. Who are these women serving? Are they always upper-class women, for example, in countries where women barely have a voice? And when they have the opportunities to speak, are they really being heard? The final article was on skateboarding, and that was an interesting idea because, I'm not a skateboarder, but of course I've seen people skateboard and I've seen people at skate parks, and I find skateboarding to be really impressive, what people can do. This article was quite a short piece, and I don't think it delved very much into the different aspects of skateboard culture, but it did talk about skateboarding as something that challenges the establishment. Skateboarding is about, I don't want to say it's about breaking the law, but it is about trying to push the envelope and, trying to step outside of what is acceptable. Hence, people skateboarding on railings and stairs and everywhere they're not supposed to be skateboarding. But I believe the Olympic Committee is considering skateboarding as an Olympic sport. And so there's questions as to, whether having skateboarding as an Olympic sport, whether that is good for the skateboarding community or whether it kind of places restraints on this sport. It was a short piece, but I thought it was a, you know, again, a good introduction to the topic. So yeah, I gave 4 out of 5 stars to this magazine. The photography is incredible. I don't want to show really much of what's in here because the photography is, you're paying for the photography just as much as you're paying for the articles. I will put one picture here, which is this triptych of all of the great massacres in world history and telling you how many people died. And World War II was the worst, but I think World War I was like 15 million. There was like 40 million for Genghis Khan, I think. Stalin was 20 million, which is fascinating when you think about how Stalin was allies with the US and Britain. And then the wars of religion that I study, 30 Years' War was 7.5 million. The French Wars of Religion, which is actually the period I study, is 3 million. The Atlantic slave trade is included, 16 million. I mean, it's harrowing when we think about how many hundreds of millions of people have been killed because of warfare. But World War II was definitely the worst. So yeah, I do recommend this, and I can hope to continue with this series. Thank you everybody for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.